Greetings all. My name is Nzinga Nomo. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm the owner and founder of Afriware Books Company, been in business since 1993. And we have a very special guest with us today on our podcast, Black Business Banter, who I will introduce shortly. But for those of you who do not know me or know of Afterware Books located in Maywood, Illinois, we pride ourselves on providing a platform for artists and advocates who instill a sense of cultural pride. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce as part of a celebration of the 160th birthday of Ida B. Wells, her great granddaughter, Michelle Duster. Please, in virtual land, put your hands together for Miss Michelle Duster. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Nzinga.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So it's been a delight in the few moments we've had to meet you personally. And we have come to the conclusion that there is so much to cover, but we are going to do our level best to at least give some insight to the Chicago focus that you have had in the last few years to your great grandmother's spectacular legacy. We're going to share the screen so that the items you speak of will be seen by our audience. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, there we are. Please, and do not hesitate to share any accomplishments of yourself and or your great grandmother that are relevant to the discussion. So would you please start by talking about, well, I visited recently the historical marker of your great grandmother and the home of your great grandmother. And your website features a number of other projects that you have worked on in her honor. So start wherever you are most comfortable.
Well, I mean, I've been working to help people remember my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, for quite a while, actually. The first project that I ever worked on was in 1988. I worked on a documentary film for PBS's American Experience series. It's called Ida B. Wells, A Passion for Justice. And so that was quite a while ago, but that actually was the first project that I worked on. But I learned a lot, obviously, about her, not only from a family perspective, but from a scholarly perspective. I was there to, when different scholars were interviewed, and I got a chance to talk to them off camera. And so I learned a lot of information that was different than what I learned only, talking to family members. Back at that time, 1988, was the only other real thing that had been done to remember my great-grandmother was her autobiography, which was published in 1970, that my grandmother, her youngest daughter, edited. And then there were the Ida B. Wells homes in Chicago, which was a public housing community named after her. It was stood in Chicago from 1941 to 2002, so over 60 years. So in 1988, there were only two real tributes to her, which was the book, her own book, and the homes. And so from that point forward, there have been several other biographies that have been written by other people. But starting in 2008 was when I got more active in helping her to be remembered. Part of it, there were sort of a few things that happened. One is that the Ida B. Wells homes started to be demolished in 2002. And so 6 years later, in 2008, I just kind of came up with an idea. I'm like, well, what is going to happen, you know, to help people remember her after the homes are gone? And so that's kind of what started me on this journey. Just the idea that the homes were no longer going to be here. And so there needed to be something else to remember her. So I first approached Mayor Daley at the time about what was the city going to do to remember who Ida was. And a committee had already been formed, initiated by the former residents of the Ida B. Wells homes. So that was a really good thing because it was community driven and grassroots driven versus like our family, you know, going and demanding this. It was definitely the community that initiated it. And I became involved with the committee to give sort of family input. So that started this. And then I also, Paula Giddings was creating she had been working on a biography of Ida for a very long time. She interacted with several of my family members, mostly my father's generation. And so when I knew her book was coming out, which was a biography of Ida, I came up with the idea to create a book that edited a book of Ida's writings, her writing, so that people could read Ida's original writing without it being edited. And I thought it would complement Paula's book, you know, because if they read all about her, Ida's life, then they might be curious to read Ida's writing. So that was my idea, was that it would complement Paula's book. So those two things happened at the same time. I was working on the editing. It was called Ida in Her Own Words, and working with this committee to create. At that time, it wasn't even a monument. It was just like, we want to do something. We hadn't even decided what it was going to be yet. And it took a couple of years of sort of researching different types of ways that she could, that a tribute could be created. And we finally settled on a monument. And then we settled on Richard Hunt as the sculptor. Settled meaning that's what we agreed to. It was our first choice and our dream to have Richard Hunt do the work. For several reasons, he was our first choice. So we were so happy that he agreed to work on it. It took quite a few years to get the project actually done, and it was installed in 2021, just a little over a year ago, June 30th. So between 2008 and now, I have edited a second book of Ida's writing that she did in England. She traveled to England in 1894. And so I found the articles that she wrote from that trip and edited those and put them into a book so people could read about what she wrote about overseas. I've worked on, I'll just go through the books first. I've worked on Ida B. the Queen, which is a hybrid biography slash sort of contemporizing Ida and connecting her to people and events that have happened after her, to show, you know, her legacy, the impact of her legacy on today's world. And then a children's picture book, Ida B. Wells' Voice of Truth, which was published this year. Yes. There was an Ida B. Wells doll that came out just this past January. That I worked with Mattel. My brother and I worked with Mattel to create the doll. So there was a lot of family input into that product. And then as far as public history projects, there was Ida B. Wells, like I mentioned, Ida B. Wells National Monument, which was created by Richard Hunt. It was installed last year. So it's still fairly new, and we're hoping we want it to become literally a national tourist destination. There was an Ida B. Wells marker, a marker to remember the homes as well as who they were named after, which I thought was important to create, so that the homes, which were such a huge part of the South Side of Chicago's history and experience, it should be remembered, even though the homes are not there anymore. And I had Honorary Street, Ida B. Wells Way on that same corner, because that's where the Ida B. Wells homes were. And then had I initiated having a suffrage monument created to remember Ida and her contemporaries who worked to make it so that women could have the right to vote in general, but also in Illinois has its own unique history because women got the right to vote in 1913 in Illinois. So Ida was involved in, advocating for state rights. In Illinois was the first state east of the Mississippi to grant women the right to vote. So the history of Illinois is unique, and it needs to be more well known when it comes to women's rights. And then Ida B. Wells Drive, which was Congress Parkway. Again, I worked with Alderman King to make that happen, and the name was changed through City Council. It was changed in 2018, but then the actual signage went up in 2019, and the dedication ceremony took place in 2019. So there were sort of two steps involved in making that happen. First, you have to have City Council vote, and then it's a lot, to get all the signage changed. So those are the projects that I've worked on in Chicago. There are a lot of other projects going on around the country to recognize or to include Ida in other suffrage monuments. There's one in Memphis that was just installed this past March. And then there are some other projects that are slated for Washington, D.C. There's some schools that are named after Ida, one in Washington, D.C. and one in Portland. There's one in Chicago as well. But the two in Portland and Washington, D.C. are more new. And they have created, in Washington, they created a statue in front of the school of Ida. There's a lot going on. I can go on and on, but I mean, she's getting national attention. And within this 4-year period of time from 2018, what's helped create support for the projects that I've been working on has been Ida was awarded a Pulitzer Prize special citation in 2020, posthumous, obviously. And then in 2018, it was 2018, the New York Times did a series called Overlooked, which were delayed obituaries. And so Ida was the first one to be featured in that. And so that, the New York Times has a large reach. And so it sort of elevated her name and her story, and it helped propel some of the other projects that came afterwards. So it's been a whirlwind 4 years, but in some ways the projects are connected, or one project has led to another. And then also in 2020 was the centennial of the 19th Amendment. So there was a lot of focus on the suffragists, and there were a lot of people who were focusing on Black women in the suffrage movement, and Ida was included, involved in the suffrage movement. So again, that kind of increased in interest in her and her story. And so I just kind of rode the wave and helped people learn who she was and, how she was involved in all of these different initiatives in our country.
Well, Ms. Duster, I definitely want to thank you for, again, championing her legacy and bringing it to an even wider audience. She worked in so many different areas. I know that it's no small task we're talking about. And I certainly welcome you anytime to join us again to highlight the newest project or book or, monument that's coming out. She definitely holds a dear place in our hearts. And of course, her writings are made available at Afriware. We're going to have a whole category, dedicated to her and your family's works. And we, things are not enough, but we recognize it's very important work that you are continuing forward. So I want to be respectful of your time. For those of you listening in, Ms. Duster is traveling and multitasking. And we're just happy to have a few moments that hopefully we have piqued your interest and curiosity to research more about her. I'm so thankful that her original writings are available. That's my personal favorite. I like to read the original, right? The primary source. There's no replacement to that, in my opinion. So with that, thank you. Any closing remarks or notations?
Well, I mean, I'll just say that one of the goals that I've had with the work that I've done is to humanize my great grandmother, Edie Wells. She was, a civil rights activist. She was a pioneer in data journalism. She was part of the suffrage movement. She was also considered a social worker because she opened up a rooming house for Southern migrants in Bronzeville in 1910, the first wave of the Great Migration that happened. I mean, she did a lot of different things. And some people can feel like intimidated by her legacy. And I've met a lot of people who are like, oh, I could never do what she did and whatever. And I just want people to feel that there are parts of her that they can absolutely relate to, not be in awe of, but literally feel like they can relate to her. One of the things I tried to do in Ida Be the Queen was to humanize her in a way that would make people realize that she did amazing things. I mean, she was extraordinary, but she also, was lonely at times. She also had self-doubt. She also felt discouraged at times. And I wanted people to know that she had the same emotional, range as everybody else. And so hopefully that makes her feel relatable. And I've also tried to make sure that I've created work in spaces that are accessible to everybody. And that's why, with the first two books that I edited, I was purposeful about making her work accessible to everybody because I realized everybody's not going to go to the archives and read, documents from 100 years ago. And so I wanted to make her work accessible and make it and shape it in ways that relate to today. So for both of those books, I added essays of what is happening currently to tie it to what was happening during her time, so people can see the parallels or just how what happened during her time affects what happens today. Because I think it's important for history to not seem dry and and irrelevant. Like like what happened 100 years ago does impact what happens today. And so that's my hope with everything that I'm doing, is that people can see connections and see themselves in the work.
And you're doing it so well. Any school could take a day trip, to these monuments and say, oh, it's not just in black and white in a dusty book on a shelf, right? You can go and talk, and you can interview people who stayed in Ida B. Wells homes. It's multifaceted is her works. And so I'm so thankful that, the accessibility was your focus. It shows. It shows.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I mean, people, they're creating walking and biking tours of Bronzeville. Actually, there's one happening July 30th. I can send you the information. It's with the Chicago Race Riot Commemorative Art Project. So even if you just Google Chicago Race Riot Project, it'll probably, the website will probably come up. But they're going to be doing a book tour, a bike tour on July 30th that will incorporate several of the pieces that you just kind of showed on the website. And I've worked with a couple of people who do walking tours. So the whole idea with the pieces that are in Bronzeville were purposefully placed to make it so that they're easily walkable within like a mile radius. And so that's another hope of mine, is that people will start to, either take it upon themselves. Even Girl Trek created a walk called Ida Trek that goes around Bronzeville and, hits some of the places that are connected and relevant to Ida's life. And so, you know, it's because she lived and worked in Bronzeville the whole time she was in Chicago. And so lucky for us, you know, a lot of the things that were affiliated with her are really walking distance from each other. So people can kind of take in the whole, all of the sites, but also just realize they're walking on the same space that she actually walked on.
Yeah.
And hopefully that has an impact, you know, an emotional impact, you know, like you're literally walking on the same ground that she walked on, and she lived and breathed and raised her children in this area. Went to church in this area. You know, so there's several places in that area. I've been in contact, you know, with the people who are affiliated with the places, and just to make sure that they're all included on these walking and biking tours.
Mm-hmm. Critical to, you know, maintaining an interest in young people and in bringing out the historical monuments. To me, that's really the key. And again, I thank you, and I encourage everyone to just get out. You know, we're not quarantining as much these days. And, you know, just get out and touch and feel and talk to others and share with your neighbors about her works. It's monumental. And as we talked about earlier, keeping our legacy, especially our triumphs, you know, and our trials, what we were able to do in spite of is extremely empowering, and it helps us to continue forward, you know, through thick and thin. So yeah, I highly respect her work. I'm just talking to everybody that I, you know, that I can about the parallels in particular in her day. I mean, just like her parents were affected by an epidemic, and unfortunately died within 24 hours of each other, you know, and she, you know, obviously had to have that experience of the world kind of shutting down. And so there was so much that I was just like, oh yeah, you know, we're going through something similar with the pandemic, and there's so many more instances of that. So
right, absolutely. So hopefully people can read the books, Ida B. the Queen, for like basically teenagers and up. And then Ida B. Wells' Voice of Truth is for little kids. It's a children's picture book that mostly would be read to children. And then the other books that we mentioned, you know, Ida's, the doll, you know, so that's my hope, is that, you know, and that's why I've kind of worked in different mediums. You know, I've obviously written books, but then I've worked with a doll, and then I've worked on public history projects, because I think people are exposed to information in different ways. And so if you see the monument first, but then you want to know more about her, then you can read the book. If you read the book first, then you can go see the monument. And so to me, they're all interconnected, and they're just different ways that people learn.
Excellent point. Excellent point. We will close. We will close with that. Yeah, that's what the school system need to acknowledge, you know, and not one over the other, but they're all equally important and equally valid ways of learning. Yes, yes, yes.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I really, really appreciate you and your family. Thank you for continuing on the legacy of your great grandmother. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to end the session here. Let's see.